All right. Remember the question that I raised last Tuesday? So I showed you a lot of data showing how Korea has made this remarkable transformation from a very poor country to one of the leading economically powerful countries in the world. And the question is this, what are the factors that account for Korea's rise as an economic power, right? And the chapter that you have been assigned really gives you all the information you need. So I'm just sort of going over the stuff that's really covered in your reading packet, okay? One of the articles. And I asked you this question last Tuesday, and I got some answers. And I start with international factors, okay? And the first international factor is, or at least something that is mentioned, is what is called colonial development. As you know, Korea was colonized by Japan from 1910 to 1945. So during that period, Japan built infrastructures. It built railroads, it built roads, it built schools, okay? And it also built factories, rice mills, industries, okay? And it opened mines, so, and also the first sort of group of entrepreneurs were trained under the Japanese system. So you put all these together, and the argument goes that Korea's colonial experience laid the foundations for later economic development that began in the 1960s. And this is called a revisionist argument. Revisionist. Why revisionist? Because when Korea began to industrialize and began to show success, Korean nationalists began to argue that this is our own doing. Koreans' industriousness, leadership, and effective policies were accounting for Korea's economic success. So again, these interpretations are called nationalist interpretation, because the argument is that we did it, or we sort of achieved this economic success by ourselves, on our own, okay? Again, effective economic policies, hardworking Koreans, and also effective leadership. So we owe, or our success is due to our own doing. That is a nationalist interpretation. And then comes who? Japanese and Japan-friendly scholars who began to argue. That's why revisionists revise, right? They started to argue, no. You guys didn't do this all by yourself. Japan played a big role, okay? Because for the 36 years that Japan was in Korea for, again, it built, railroads, roads, schools, it educated, because it provided education to Koreans, right? And it built factories, it opened mines, it introduced new technologies, and it trained new group of entrepreneurs and also bureaucrats. Now, when you compare these two, or in your estimation, or if you're to take sides, which side is making more sense? Nationalist interpretation or revisionists? Or what's wrong with the revisionist argument? Should former colonial power take credit for what happened later? Or should former colonial powers be forever damned for the continuing economic backwardness of many former colonies? Look at all of the world. Most of Africa. I mean, was there any country in Africa that was not colonized? Morocco? And? Liberia. So that's just two? More. I'm asking. Ethiopia. Okay, let's say, can I say handful? Okay, only a handful of countries in Africa were not colonized. And in Asia too, I think only a handful were not colonized, right? Now, most, if not all of these, I would say not all, but most of these former colonies are not doing well economically. Now, can or should former colonial powers be criticized for the continuing economic backwardness of former colonies? Yes?
I'm not taking any sides. At first glance, I think you definitely make the argument of revisionist point of view, in the sense that if people think about the first law of Korea is its enormous and pragmatic technology, and I think that was, I'm not sure what verb I should use, inspired, given by, I guess, the Japanese dominance at the time. So I guess you could say because of Japan in a way, or their occupation for a certain period of time, Korea did take some ideas which facilitated their rapid economic development.
Again, I think when you're asked this question, what you try to do is sort of think about the revisionist arguments and try to sort of come up with points that you could criticize or sort of take issues with. So, for example, one argument against the revisionist argument is this. You know, during the Korean War, do you know that more bombs were dropped in Korea than bombs dropped in Germany during World War II? More bombs in this small peninsula. So practically everything was destroyed. So you think about factories, roads, railways that Japan built, totally gone. Okay? So that's the kind of, sort of taking issues I'm talking about. Then,
That's what I mean is transformation.
oh,
As in the physical reference.
again, I'm not sort of criticizing what you just said.
Thought came up, the
Yeah.
word came up in my head.
Very good. Anyone else? And here's another thing. When you think about things that really sort of contributed to Korea's economic success, you have to say, or scholars say, that it included effective policies, okay? Economic policies. Now, who designed these economic policies? US trained economists. So that's another thing that sort of goes against this revisionist argument, because without effective economic policies, country goes nowhere. Okay? But these economists were all trained in the United States. Okay? So that's real, like no real input from Japan, okay, when it comes to the economic policies. Now, for me personally, one of the greatest factors for economic success is leadership. Now, I think I asked you this on Tuesday. A country that had so much potential, okay, because of its oil wealth, is still poor because of its leadership. That's terrible. Because this leadership for any effective economic development has never been around. Although you had these elites who were trained outside of Korea, they were just not into putting efforts to, sort of make the country become economically successful. Okay? So now, that's not the end of the story here, because leadership we had in Park Chung-hee, right? So he was, as far as economic development is concerned, one of the most prominent figures. And this is where revisionist argument comes in. Remember, one of the key arguments of revisionist argument is that it trained, okay, Korean elite, okay, to be entrepreneurs, to learn about modern ways. Now, Park Chung-hee was trained under the Japanese system, okay? So, for that, I guess Japan could take credit, okay? We taught everything that he knows, kind of idea, right? Okay, now, anyone else with an idea about the argument involving the nationalist sort of interpretation versus revisionist argument? Anything that may come to your mind? Yeah. Mm. Okay, interesting point. Anyone else? But is this an interesting sort of debate? Because, but what I find interesting also is how, for the sake of argument, maybe some scholars may be, saying or getting involved in this debate. But also, the first person to raise this revisionist argument happened to be a Japanese scholar. So there is that sort of nationalist on the part of Japan, right? Sort of nationalistic interpretation. But I think when it comes to this argument, no one needs to be really passionate about, right? Because it's a very good possibility that what Japan did, laid the foundation, right, for the later economic development of Korea. Another thing that I could mention is how that what Japan did in Korea was for its own good. I think I mentioned this under urbanization. See, it developed cities in the south when it imported large amounts of rice from Korea, and when it invaded Manchuria and had this sort of ambition of conquering mainland China, it started to develop North Korea, right? And so all the things that Japan did were for its own good, never for the good of Korea. Okay? So maybe what Japan did had an unintended consequence. Okay? So that's something that we could easily accept in a way. I think one of the key phrases that you could sort of always come up with, even in interpersonal relations, unintended consequence. It's really an interesting and useful phrase. Any other thoughts as I turn the slides? So that's one international factor that we could talk about. And the second international factor, so the first international factor has to do with the period from 1910 to 1945. The second international factor refers to a period between 1945 and mid-1970s, and maybe I should have put this in a question form, and the role here is played by the United States. Okay? Korea was liberated from Japan in 1945, and since then, the United States has become the most important ally of Korea. Okay, so U.S. Played a major role in Korea's rapid economic development. Because U.S. provided Korea with large amount of aid. Okay, so. Well, this is a well-known sort of theory. Okay? When the same capital is invested, underdeveloped countries can achieve much more rapid economic development than developed ones. Also, Korea's early capitalist class, some comprising colonial collaborators, had the backing of Americans. So military aid from the United States, hundreds of millions of dollars for developing Korea's own military force, and U.S. interest in Korea was because of the Cold War. As you know, the Cold War sort of began from, as soon as the World War II ended, the Cold War began, and Korea's strategic importance in sort of preventing or stopping the spread of communism beyond the peninsula made the USA to commit its sort of military strength to Korea. Okay, so but we must admit that all along the United States was more interested in saving Japan than saving Korea. Okay? Remember the war in 1950? If you really think about why the United States got involved, was it to solely save Korea from falling under the hands of North Korea or communism? I think many political pundits would say no. It was simply to stop communism from spreading to Japan. Or once Korea fell, then Japan was in danger. Okay? Because that's why, that's sort of a side story, right? The point is, during the time of Cold War, Korea was important to the United States. That's why it provided military aid and also economic aid. And there was this strong belief that when a place where there is a strong capitalist economy, there's also anti-communist sort of tendency or sentiment. Okay? So U.S. provided capital and technology in this way between 1946 and 1976, the US applied a total of $12.6 billion in economic and military assistance. Okay? Out of these, more than half of the total aid was in the form of the military. You think it was a good investment or not for the United States? Excellent investment. Why? Korea is one of the top 3 buyers of US arms. And why do we keep on buying from the United States? Because from 1945, we've been stuck with US arms. Okay? So unless you radically transform or change everything, it's like owning a window system, right? You have to keep on using the window system. Okay? So don't think that US is somehow any different here. Okay? Korea, for its economic size, is one of the biggest providers of ODA. But do you think ODA is provided just, without any strings attached? No. Most, I would say, of ODA come with strings attached. Meaning, you, let's say, provide 1,000 Hyundai trucks. Then the idea is that they must, use Hyundai car parts. You must have Hyundai experts to do maintenance. So again, so what the U.S. did with the military aid and economic aid came with these lot of strings attached. Okay? Question. Only 2 countries received more aid than Korea during the same period. From 1946 to 1976, only 2 other countries received more aid. Which countries do you think they were? And my Maxim coffee is on the line. Germany, no. This rich country, even back then. No, I'm talking about, let's say, in the 1960s on. 46 to 76. It is after the war. But let's say, Germany was, let's say, recuperating from the effects of the war, but I think it probably recovered pretty much, by early 1960s, right? But in this 30-year period, only 2 countries received more aids. Yeah, I'm talking about the U.S. providing aid to these countries. Vietnam. Yes. Yes, South Vietnam. Because it's also embroiled in this capitalist versus communist conflict, right? And the other one, so one Maxim for him. Chile, no. I thought this would be an easy one. It's a country that still receives billions of dollars in aid. And you would think, wow, a country that rich still receive that much aid. The money that could be used for your tuition. Give up? Here we go. Don't have it. It's Israel. not surprising. US gave South Korea privileged access to US markets, like duty-free status. US accepted South Korea's protectionist policies as necessary part of the growth process. So, I think I mentioned this before. Policymakers from many developing countries visit Korea to learn about how Korea succeeded in achieving economic development. They try to learn, and scholars and Korean policymakers tell them all these nice things about Korea without telling them how they'll never be able to duplicate what Korea did. And I told you that's because you can no longer practice protectionist policy. But for Korea, for more than 20 years, Korea was able to practice protectionist policy, protecting Samsung, LG, Hyundai from foreign competition. And that 20-year period was so critical in making them what they are. And that will never happen in today's economic climate. Okay? So when I see these policymakers or scholars who have these special lectures to these, foreign policymakers, I really criticize them. How could you give them false hope that they could do something, okay? When there's nothing they could do, really. For example, when Koreans talk about the factors of Korea's success, they often talk about education, okay, and hardworking Koreans. Okay, so let's say, just think of a country in Africa. You educate them, okay? You make them work hard. Now, without the ability to develop your industry, okay? Meaning, coming up with products that could be competitive in the world market. Can you have a meaningful economic growth? Impossible, okay? You would have all these college graduates without jobs because there's no industrial growth. That's how dire the situation is for developing economies. It has a chance in hell to develop. And that's the cruel world we're living in. Okay? Winner takes all. Okay? Zero-sum game. You think life in Korea is hard? Life outside of Korea in developing country is much harder. Okay? So, all right, that's second international factor. The third factor is, so when you ask me about the role of Japan, I think this is more important, okay? The Normalization Treaty of 1965 is this. When Korea was liberated, Korea was so pissed off at Japan that we didn't sign a treaty, or we didn't normalize relationship with Japan until 1965. Meaning, for 20 years, we didn't have embassies, okay, between Japan and Korea. Because we had this still a lot of anger, okay, and pain of the Japanese atrocities committed in Korea, okay. For some of you who are not familiar with the idea, like, why is Korea so, hostile? Like, I'm talking about politically, okay, toward Japan. It is because Japanese rule in Korea was probably one of the most hostile sort of regime or ruling in the history of colonies. Because we did have many independence fighters, and when they were captured, they were executed, okay? And from the late 1930s, Koreans were forced to change their last names to the Japanese. And they were ordered to speak Japanese only. Now, how many countries do you know where those policies were implemented? I mean, for example, in countries where England colonized, yes, you were encouraged to learn English because it was an avenue of success. But no one was forced to speak English, right? But that's what we were subjected to. And to have your name changed from Korean to Japanese, again, do you know of any country where the colonial power forced you to change your name to that of, let's say, English? So that is to really erase your identity. That's how far Japan went. Okay? That is why we have this very strong sentiments against Japanese colonial past. Okay? And also the comfort women issue, sex slaves. So these sort of cleansed sort of history that still continues to haunt us, right? But back in 1965, we normalized relationship with Japan, and for that, this is what we got: $500 million in grants, $200 million in public loans, $300 million in commercial credits. So we got $1 billion. Wow, that's a lot of money. Isn't that a lot of money? We only got $500 million for all the atrocities committed by Japan for 36 years. You think that's enough money or not? In today's money, that should be about $10 billion. For 36 years of taking everything that we had, okay, and killing so many Koreans. Yes? So this is where USA is also blamed, because USA was the one that really pushed Korea to accept this offer from Japan. Why was USA so intent on pushing Korea to accept this terrible offer from Japan? Because USA sort of fund, they were having, I mean, during the 1965 and for the next 7, 8 years, what was the biggest issue for the United States, outside of the United States? Vietnam. So much money, and everything was so concentrated on Vietnam that it did not have enough sort of money to take care of Korea. So it, brought in Japan. Okay? And, can someone check? How long was the Philippines colonized by Japan for? Definitely less than 10 years. 5 years? Okay, the Philippines was colonized by Japan for, I think, 3 to 5 years. Guess how much it got as a reparation? From what I know, if I remember correctly, either $2 or $3 billion. And we got a dinky $500 million. And latest CIA record showed that Park Chung-hee's party received tens of millions of dollars from Japan to make this happen. Okay? To really get this going really fast. Okay? So there is that element of corruption. I'm being recorded right now. You know that? So between 1950, now I'm losing my voice. Between 1953 and 1962, USA funded 70% of Korea's imports and 80% of. Now, the thing about this is really, and I say here, right? That every time if there's a group asking for compensation, Japan always says, no, we gave you this money, and for that, we are clear of all war responsibilities. Okay? And what we're referring to is, again, comfort women, and also millions of, I'm talking millions of Koreans who were forced to work as forced laborers. And again, forced labor is really a misnomer. It should really be slaves, but temporary slaves, because you're not free to leave, you don't get paid. Okay? You work as long as you can breathe and move. Okay? And again, millions. And it is just an estimate. Why? All the records have been destroyed. Okay? And some of these companies we know are, Mitsubishi is one of the companies that had forced laborers. And have they paid a cent? No. And that's a big contrast to what German companies did. You know how Jewish forced laborers were paid from one account $16 billion for their forced labor service. Koreans, zero. Okay? And why is this happening? And who do we blame? The United States. Why? The pressure can only come from where? The United States. But is the United States putting any pressure on Japan? No. Just, says lip service. Oh, Japan, you should pay. That's not a pressure. Okay? Pressure is, arm twisting, like trade embargo, okay? Or, bringing back your ambassador to a country or whatever, right? But again, that's why I've always said to, diplomats in Korea, we should no longer be a sidekick to the United States, because we'll never be considered an equal partner, because USA always has Japan. Okay? So we gotta play a little bit of hard to get. I like you, but But what has Korea done all the time? Always grabbing on the leg of the United States. Don't leave me. Just think of the interpersonal relations. Okay? You gotta always play hard to get. And the biggest lesson that gives to diplomacy is that you also do that when it comes to inter-country relations. You play hard to get. But these Korean diplomats don't know how to do that. It's always. And that's why we are always ill-treated. Am I making sense here or not? Do you feel that we're being treated well by the United States? I'm not talking about lip service. Lip service is really lip service. It's like sending you this empty kiss. But never really, making... I shouldn't say. All right. Between 1953 and 19... But another thing, on a more positive note, why was this important? Because when your country is just industrializing, what do you need the most? Capital, money. Never mind educating people, never mind policies. You need money. Like if you need to start a business, what do you need? Money, there you go. That's why we needed money, and where did that come from? Japan. So for that, at least, we gotta acknowledge that Japan played a role here. Okay? That it gave us this huge amount of money at the time to kickstart, to fund. Okay? I mean, this is when, let's say in 1969, we would need $1 million to make sure that we don't go bankrupt. Now, am I exaggerating here? $1 million, a country's fate depended on whether to not go bankrupt or not? I mean, really, $1 million. That's how desperate Korea was at the time. It had all these ideas, all these policies, but it needed capital. Okay? And we needed to do this in every way possible. That is why, ask your parents. In the 1960s and 70s, you know, you probably, Korean students right now, right now, probably was like had lunch in the cafeteria, but students up to the 1990s, they took their lunch to school. Rice. No, not rice. Because now we have 100% rice self-sufficiency. Okay, we produce more rice than we could consume. That's why there's so much leftover rice that we could easily give to North Korea. But until the 1990s, early 1990s, we had to import. And when we needed all the capital we could get our hands on, you think rice imports were freely allowed? Or the import business of rice was strictly prohibited in a way. So consumption of rice was curtailed. So every time you took your lunch to school, teacher checked your lunch. So at lunchtime at 12, open your lunchbox and he would walk around to make sure that your lunch did not contain more than 50% rice. That was Korea only, 20 years ago. All right? And the only time that you were allowed to bring 100% rice was when? There was a time when you were allowed to bring 100% rice. Just take a guess. If there's one day that you could bring 100% rice to school for your lunch, that is? That's a good one. Buddha's birthday. Just kidding. Your birthday. Yeah? It was the only time that you were allowed to bring 100% rice. Isn't that an interesting story? That happened till the early 1980s. That's how desperate Korea was for capital. Okay? Then when we need to import something, as long as that was used to make things that we could export, they were freely imported. But if it was for like eating, like rice, it was seriously curtailed. Okay? So until I think the mid-80s, and maybe as late as the late 1980s, having 100% rice at home was a sign of wealth. Okay? Okay, so I don't have to say it. You get the idea, right? So our government needed foreign capital, and it sort of went along with this deal that was not so generous. Okay, but again, I think we could have pushed for a bigger sort of, compensation, right? And the third international factor was the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1973. And when you look at this, think of it this way. A war, as devastating it may be, it's sometimes a boon for a certain country. Now, when the war broke out in Korea, guess which country was laughing to the bank? I don't want to use the expression laughing, but was like really enjoying economic downfall, the economic sort of boom. Japan. Okay? Because during the Korean War, USA used Japanese sort of ports or areas as bases from which military supplies were sent, and a lot of military supplies were actually manufactured in Japan. So it contributed hugely to the Japanese economy, as much as 10 to 20% during the war. Okay? So like that, for Korea, look at this, between 1965 and 1973, more than 300,000 South Korean soldiers fought in Vietnam. And look at the casualties here. Up to 5,000 deaths and 17,000 wounded. So, you think Korea went to Japan? We sent our troops to Vietnam because we are committed to democracy and peace? Or do you think USA twisted the arms of Korea? It goes both ways. There's an arm twisting, and at the same time, carrot will give you all these benefits. And from what I know, Korean government was paid handsomely for all, because all the training costs and all the sort of costs were covered by the United States. But who took how much money from where, nobody knows. And I'm still interested in learning, because you can imagine that not a single person from a well-to-do family went to fight in Vietnam. All that people, 300,000 plus, it all came from lower class. Okay? And this many died. And my question is, what did the family get for compensation? Or did the government pocket everything? Because some kind of a compensation must have been paid out by the US government, right? But what about wounded? Someone who is permanently paralyzed. What did he get? Or what did they get? If you could find any information on this, please share it with me. So this is a really dark history for me personally, because I mean, when I see this kind of a stat, I really go crazy, you know? Because these are poor people, and what did they get? Okay? At least in the United States, you know, if you die from a combat situation, I think there is definitely a compensation that one could sort of accept as being sort of, in a way, enough, at least relatively speaking. But anyway, I think although we do say that this was a factor, there is that dark side, okay? That it was paid for with these heavy casualties. Okay? And Korean contractors participated in American construction projects in South Vietnam and elsewhere. So many conglomerates got their big break, okay? Including Hanjin and Hyundai. And Hanjin is best known for the nut case. No, what's the name of the nut? You know, the Korean Air sort of nut rage, yes. But what's the name of the nut? Macadamia? The macadamia nut case is Hanjin. So we are learning about history in a very different angle. Hanjin is the sort of the mother company of Korean Airline, okay? And it got its big break, or before it landed in Vietnam, it was a small company, but it earns a lot of money in Vietnam, and it became what it is today. Okay? And Korean firms made use of the Vietnam experience to expand into the international construction business, like the Middle East. Okay? So in the 1970s, thousands of Koreans, if not tens of thousands of Koreans, went to the Middle East to work as construction workers. So, given the economic standard or the living standard of Korea at the time, the workers who went to the Middle East, they earned a lot of money. So, in the 1970s, there were many sort of stories of like wives not really being faithful because husbands kept on sending money, and that was really a lot of money. And there were those stories. And you know why Korean workers were able to like send practically everything they earn back home, unlike any other place. Because in the Middle East, can you drink alcohol? No. Can you go to places to dance? No. Because wherever there are a lot of Koreans, what do you find? Galanjujeon. Places to be drink. Okay? But they were not allowed to do that. So that's why they were very hardworking, just totally, not doing anything other than working, right? So, yes, and even today, there are many Korean construction companies, especially those of top conglomerates like Samsung and SK and Hyundai. They do have construction projects in the Middle East, but no Korean sort of works as sort of an on-site sort of a manual laborer because our labor costs are too high. Because if you look at like news footages of workers at construction sites in the Middle East, they're typically workers from Bangladesh, India, working for about $500 a month. Okay? For that amount, can any Korean go there to work? No way. That's why. So again, we're still there. The companies are still there, but workers are no longer there. Yes. North Koreans too. Working for the glory of their leader. That's fact, no. I have a major wonder about this guy. What does he eat? No, just kidding. The guy has been educated, I think, in Switzerland since like junior high. And how could he be such a ruthless leader? If he has eaten so much cheese and drank that much Coca-Cola, you would think that he would be half Gandhi-like person, but here is this guy who is, maybe that dictatorship is in his blood. Yes. I mean, I would be surprised. Why not Kentucky Fried Chicken at the same time? That tells me that he's not a major burger lover. Because, if you love burger, which one would you like, McDonald's or Burger King? I'm just kidding. Anyway, let's move on. So, from 1965 and 1970, the South Korean government received $1.1 billion in payments. Isn't that amazing? That's how much Korea got from the United States for its involvement in the war. And who paid the price? Soldiers. But the benefits were kept by the government. Okay? More than 80 Korean companies did lucrative business in Vietnam, from transportation to supply, construction to entertainment. Maybe, Hallyu, the K-pop, had its roots in Vietnam. I don't know. From which the country accrued another $1 billion for exports to and services in Vietnam. Secret U.S. bonuses paid to Park's government for Korean soldiers who fought in Vietnam, totaling that much money, and again, nobody knows whether that money is paid out to soldiers. Okay? So when we add all these funds to the $1.1 billion in direct payments, the total U.S. allocations to Park's regime amounted to about 30% of the ROK's, that's the Republic of Korea's, foreign exchange earnings from 1966 to 1969. Isn't this amazing? Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War, containing some dark sides, it really was important for Korea's sort of industrialization drive. Right? Wars may provide experiences for military officers who will inflict future casualties. You know, Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo, both former presidents of Korea, they all served in Vietnam. And, I talked about about some of the atrocities committed by Japan during the colonial period. Korean soldiers were most feared by Vietnamese because they were ruthless. And I don't want to really share this with you, but look it up if you're interested. Just, type in Korean, things like Korean soldiers' brutalities in Vietnam, and you'll get a lot of results. And it's really, really terrible. It's just something I don't want to talk about. That's how brutal they were. Okay? So we are not all that good people. Or we were not. In 1985, the Plaza Accord, or Plaza Agreement, was an agreement between the governments of France, West Germany, and Japan, the United States, and the UK to depreciate the US dollar in relation to the Japanese yen and German Deutschmark. Okay? So so why is this important? Because it made Korean products cheaper in the international market. You know that during the Lee Myung-bak's administration, and even today, our government does try to make sure that the value of Korean won does not go too high. Because if the value of Korean won is high, that makes Korean products that much more expensive to buy in foreign markets. So one of the ways that the Abe administration in Japan is doing to ensure that it sort of, recovers from this, more than 20-year-old recession is to depreciate Japanese yen, right? With $1 US, how much can you buy, like Japanese yen today? Something like that, right? But at the height of, let's say, 2-3 years ago, $1 was worth like 80 cents USA, right? So, this is what happened in 1985. It sort of appreciated the value of yen and Deutschmark so high that Korean products were that much cheaper to buy in foreign markets, especially in the United States. Okay. So we sometimes say that in the 1980s, Korea benefited from 3 lows. Okay, one is low Korean currency. Second, low interest loans. Low interests. And third is low oil price. Okay? I mean, not for the whole decade. I'm just saying for a certain period in the 1980s, that's what they benefited from. All right. Second sort of factor that we can talk about. So one is international. And within international, of course, you have Japanese, USA, Second Japanese, and Vietnam, and Plaza Accord. And second sort of a main factor is something that happened within, okay? That is within Korea. Okay? And first thing that we can talk about is the role of the state. Okay? Does anybody have a copy of the syllabus? This is our 12th week or 11th? 11th? Okay. 11th, 12th. So we only have one more topic to cover, right? And that makes the total of 3 topics for your final exam?
This is economy, right? This topic is economy, right?
This topic is?
It says urbanization, economy, aging, and multi-ethnic group.
So I think from the looks of it, we can only do 3 topics. No. Today, and we have to do 1 makeup class, right? So, whether we can do 3 or 4, I don't know. I mean, 3 for sure. Whether we can do 4th or not. Anyway, the role of the state. Now, the capitalist economy, you leave it up to the market, right? Supposedly. But what Korea did was to have the government have a sort of heavy hands-on the economic development. So the person who is sort of, most associated with Korea's economic development is former President Park Chung-hee. He's the father of the current president, right? And he staged a coup in 1961, and since he became the president through election, he did have a presidential election, and he became a president, and he served as the president for 18 years. When in 1979 he was assassinated. It wasn't really assassinated; it was just shot to death by one of the closest associates, right? Just sitting in front of him, right? That's not assassination, right? I mean, assassination is like when someone is like hiding back behind a curtain or something. Maybe I watched too many Hollywood movies. Again, they were having like a drink, and he just took out his gun and shot him, right? Is that still assassination? I think we have to look up the definition of assassination. So if you shoot someone through your back like this, that's assassination. But if you shoot them right in the face, that's murder. Or if you kill someone like a big name, that's assassination. Right? If someone gets like shot to death, and that person happens to be a manual laborer, would that be called assassination?
I'm just curious, is there a reason why I killed him? Because of his raging just like I hate you, instead of my life. I guess that's murder, but it's political reason. It's
political reason.
I don't.
It's really not clear why he killed, because he was like such a powerful guy, and the continuance of the regime, would have allowed him, that much more political and other successes. But he sort of, in a way, relinquished all these potential windfalls by killing the president, because as history would have it, instead of him becoming a hero, he was executed by who? Erdogan, right? Because he had his own political ambition, and he needed to get rid of him, right? Because if he was allowed to live, then he would have become a hero and maybe the next president, right? Yeah.
Wikipedia says that assassination is the deliberate killing of a prominent person, usually for committing political reasons.
Thank you. So there are two keywords, political reason and prominent person. So it was an assassination. All right. Okay, that's him. You know, this could be an exam. I'll be asking you which one is personal for. The next question is, who is this guy? And you gotta know, okay? Do you see any resemblance between him and Bakane? Now, in the United States, can you say Obama is ugly? Or do you get jail sentence for saying that? Oh, sorry. Doesn't matter. Now, can you say our current president is whatever, like freely? Just kidding. See, isn't this crazy? Even jokingly, I want to say, you know, she's whatever. But I don't feel free. Right? Like if you say something really negative, at least in writing, it does. Yeah, that's the state of democracy that we live in right now.
That doesn't please me.
Of course not. Yeah, definitely we don't really have full freedom that we should have. And on that note, I'll stop here and I'll see you next week.